Hey, so what I want to talk about today is the Passover Seder, the biblical verses that make it up, and in general, what it is. And I want to sort of start out historically. What does the Passover Seder look like uh, before the year 70 of the Common Era? Right? And why 70, I'll come to in a second. But basically, it was a family celebration that, according to the Torah, was meant to take place in Jerusalem, though it's not clear that that actually happened. If you can imagine all of the people of Israel gathering at the same time in Jerusalem and slaughtering the Paschal lamb, so on, hard to believe that that actually happened. Much more likely that it happened in individual homes around within the land of Israel. Uh, and this is all before 70, before the destruction of the temple. And what do? They sacrificed a lamb and they ate it together with matzah and with maror.
Mm.
And that basically was the Passover Seder. None of the texts that we have, hold on one second, let's close the door.
Zima, yeah. I
So
got it on in the kitchen and here.
none of the texts that we have,
It's very, I'm
uh,
very, uh,
all right, so none of the texts that we have predate the destruction of the temple in the year 70. Now, if that's what Passover was about, and suddenly you can't make sacrifices because after the destruction of the second temple, sacrifices no longer take place. So, what do? How do you celebrate this holiday? And that was the challenge that came before the rabbis in Yavne, where they gathered after the destruction of the temple, what was really a small town in Israel. What were they going to do about it? And the answer was primarily, uh, the question was primarily answered by a rabbi by the name of Rabban Gamliel, also known as Gamliel II. He was born around the year 80 and died in 135, in 115. So I want you to just take note of that for a moment. How old was he when he died? 35. This is a young man. Yet he and his colleagues created what we know of as the Passover Seder, at least the basics of it. Now, what is going to replace the sacrifice? And for the rabbis in general, the answer to the question of how you replace sacrifices is you study Torah. Perhaps you even study the Torah passages that describe the sacrifices. So one of the places you see this most uh, obviously, if you think about it, is the Amidah, which is said in the Musaf service every week, where we say in the temple they used to do this, and we actually say what they did. They brought shnei kvasim, two lambs without blemish, and they offered them as a sacrifice. And so we say the biblical texts and we say, okay, that's good enough. We don't sacrifice anymore. We say the biblical text. And the whole idea that Torah becomes the replacement for sacrifice is the basis of the Passover Seder. So what do we mean by Torah? We mean verses from the Torah and a particular method which is called midrash. Midrash is taking those verses and digging out of them. Midrash is to dig meanings, finding things in them. And that's essentially what the Passover Seder does. It takes a bunch of midrash and it cuts and pastes them from other places into what we know of as the text of the Haggadah, or at least the early text, right? So it's not like they sat down and wrote a bunch of midrashim. They had them and they arranged them in a particular order. And that became the Passover Haggadah. Biblical texts with midrash as they dug out meanings. So what I want to look at now, and I'm going to share my screen with you, is the oldest Haggadah that we have. It's the original. It's not exactly a Haggadah. It's actually the Mishnah from the 10th chapter of the tractate, which is called Psaki. The Mishnah is put together around the year 200. So you can see this is the time of Rabban Gamliel. Edited sources. So I'm going to share my screen. Where are we here? Oh, I don't want that. Got to get rid of that. Why am I doing that? All right, let's go to this. No, to this. Okay. Here we are. So on the eve of this is the Mishnah. It comes from Psachim, which is the tractate of the Mishnah that deals with Passover. It's at the very end. And it begins in a very legal way, which says, on the evening of Passover, that is this year, it'll be Wednesday afternoon, around the time of Mincha, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. From then, a person can't eat until it gets dark. That is when we're going to celebrate Passover. And it goes on to say, even the poorest of Jews shouldn't eat until they recline, symbol of freedom. And the distributors of charity must give poor people, no matter how poor they are, no less than 4 cups of wine for the meal. And now we get to the seder itself. Attendants pour the wine of the first cup for the leader of the seder. And there's a dispute between Bet Shammai and Beit Hillel as to the order of things. We follow Beit Hillel when we make Kiddush. What's the next thing that happens? Dipping. The attendants bring vegetables before the leader of the Seder, and he dips the chazeret, which is the lettuce, into water or vinegar to taste some food before he comes to, forget the word dessert, the meal, we'd say, which were the other bitter herbs which are eaten after the matzah. And then they bring before him matzah and bitter herbs and charoset and at least 2 cooked dishes. And then one opinion is that, well, charoset's not really a mitzvah, it's a custom. And Eliezer ben Sadok says, actually, it is a mitzvah to eat charoset. And in the period of the temple, they brought the body of the paschal lamb. And now we're up to the second cup. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. So what are they beginning here? They're beginning what was something that they knew about living in the time of the Romans. There was a Roman tradition, widely practiced, of having something called a symposium. What was a symposium? It was an intellectual meal. What would happen is that, and it was only men, women were not allowed to come to the symposium, except for slave girls and women of the night were also at the symposium. And at the symposium, they would have a meal. And then over the course of the evening, they would drink wine and they would discuss a subject, philosophy, metaphysics, whatever it was, history, poetry would be recited. And at the end, there would be a raucous celebration. Right? That was the symposium. Now, the rabbis need to create something to replace the eating of the Paschal lamb. And they look into their culture. This is remarkable to me, right? They look into their pagan culture. But the symposium began with a libation to one of the pagan gods. Set all that aside. They didn't do that. They made Kiddush, right? But what they did was they created out of this pagan milieu, they create what we know as the Passover Seder. At the symposium, they ate first, and then they continued drinking and discussing. Some scholars believe that the Passover Seder also had the meal first. When they bring out the Seder plate, they ate. And then they went on with the rest of the Seder. Unclear to me. We're going to go back to the Mishnah now, and we're going to see some things that are very familiar, but also not so familiar. So let me share again. Okay, so the attendants poured the second cup of wine for the leader of the Seder. Right? Actually, the Hebrew is mazgulo. They mixed the second cup of wine. Why? Because the wine that they drank, and everybody drank in antiquity, was a mixture of a wine extract with water. And the proportions were about 3 to 1, right? So it would be a diluted extract, and it was mixed immediately before it was consumed. And here we have, I'm going to read only, you know what, I'm going to go to the actual text of the Haggadah, of the Mishnah. It'll be easier. Okay. V'kan haben shoel aviv. And here the son asks his father, V'im ein da'at baven, and if he has no understanding, wisdom, something like that, aviv milamdo, and his father teaches him. Now, we now get very familiar words, manishtana halayla hazeh bikol halelot. So this was the words of the father. This is not something that the son says in the Mishnah. And the word manishtana halayla hazeh, which we often translate, right? Why is this night different from all other nights? Literally means, see how this night is different from all other nights. Right? How different is this night from all other nights? Exclamation point, exclamation point. And now the father goes on to explain, because the son hasn't asked a question about this strange meal that they apparently are eating. The father says, look, Shebechol halelot ein anu ochlim chametz and matzah. On all other nights we eat chametz or matzah. Tonight only matzah. On all other nights we eat other vegetables. Tonight we eat only this bitter herb. On all other nights we eat basar sli saluk umivasha. We eat our meat roasted or boiled. Tonight only roasted, and on all other nights we dip once, and tonight we dip twice. Okay, so I'm going to go back to stopping the share. So that was a little weird, right? It's not what we think about when we think about the 4 questions. So the purpose of the Seder is to get children to ask questions. You do some strange things. You break a matzah in half, you hide part, you put another part away, you dip in salt water, and then you're not eating, you're waiting around, right? And when you do all these strange things, children are supposed to say, what's going on? And then you say, oh, our ancestors were slaves in Egypt, etc., because according to the Torah, in a source we're going to see in a minute, when your child asks, you're supposed to tell them about the Exodus, right? So in order to fulfill the mitzvah of telling your child about the Exodus, they got to ask. Why would they ask? Well, because you've been done a variety of odd things which don't look like the kinds of stuff you usually do. But what if they don't ask? And here, the father, if the child has not discerned that something is different, the father is supposed to say, hey, see how different this night is from all other nights? You should have picked up on this, but since you didn't, I'm going to point out ways in which it is different. Some versions there are 3 observations, and some versions there are 4. It's a difference between the Jerusalem Talmud's Mishnah and the Babylonian Talmud's Mishnah. But it's always about this. And if you look at Maimonides later on, he reads this that way. I personally think it's the only way to read it. Not that I'm against children asking the fear kashas, right? The 4 questions, because you want to involve them in the Seder. And if we want to look at it that way, great. And if it's the youngest child that we can get involved in the Seder, great. Because after all, one of the reasons we're having this Seder is to have the children participate so we can transmit to them this tradition that we have received and followed for now over, really, if you think back to the Exodus is around the year 1200 before the Common Era, we're about 3,000 years into it in one version or another. Any questions up to this point? Anything at all? Or observations? Go ahead, Barry.
Yes, I have a question about the timeline, because the death of Jesus was presumably it comes right after a Passover seder. And that's an early first century Common Era.
Yes.
So if that's true, so there was apparently established seder.
So Jesus is living in the time of the temple, right? So we say, that the first, the last seder, Jesus's last meal,
supper. It's like the Last Supper.
The Last Supper. That's the term I was looking for. Was many people think of Passover Seder, right? So remember that is a Seder in the biblical model, right? You're having wine and you're eating matzah and you're eating, bitter herbs, and you're eating the Passover offering. What he referred, and he's doing this with his disciples, and what he refers to, they're always having wine, that's part of it. So he says, this wine is my blood and this matzah is my body. But he's not at the Seder that we are thinking of, because the Seder that we're thinking of is after the destruction, and it's different from that biblical Seder. Other questions about this or the 4 questions? Okay, so we're going to go back to, now I'll go to the English. Okay. So, okay, here we go. And now the father is going to answer by teaching his child, one way or another, the kid is asked the question. And the father is going to answer by teaching his son or children about the Exodus. And what is he going to do? He is going to tell a story that begins with disgrace and ends with salvation. And he's going to use a passage to do it, which is a passage from Deuteronomy chapter 26, beginning. We have it as 5 here, but it actually begins a bit earlier. We're going to look at it in a minute. So how is he going to answer his child? He's going to somehow start by talking about something disgraceful, and he is going to end in praise of God who's delivered them. And that is the analysis, the midrash of chapter 26 of the book of Deuteronomy. And then we get this statement by Rabban Gamliel, again, perhaps the principal author of this first seder form. Anyone who did not say these three things on Passover has not fulfilled his obligation: the paschal lamb, matzah, and bitter herbs. Notice, would anyone who did not say these things, so they can't eat them anymore. They're not going to eat the Passover lamb, the matzah, the bitter herbs. Temple was destroyed. So what can they do? Rabban Gamliel says, you'll say them. And he explained them. And then we get the Passover lamb, because the Holy One passed over the houses of our forefathers in Egypt. And we get a biblical quote, just like we had that chapter 26. You should say it is the sacrifice of the Lord's paschal offering as he passed over the houses of Israel in Egypt and smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses. And the matzah, because our forefathers were redeemed from Egypt, as it says, another quote, and they baked dough, which they took out of Egypt as case of matzot. It was not leavened. They were thrust out of Egypt. They could not tarry, neither had they prepared other food for them. And the bitter herbs, because the Egyptians embittered our forefathers' lives in Egypt, as it says, and we get this quote, they embittered their lives with hard service and mortar and brick and all manner of service in the field, that they made them serve with rigor. And then finally, in every generation, a person should view himself as though he personally left Egypt, as it is stated, and you should tell your son on that day, it is because of this which God did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. In every generation, a person must say, this is what God did for me, not this is what God did for my ancestors. And then the Mishnah goes on, and we get this text: they are therefore obligated to thank, praise, glorify, extol, exalt, honor, revere, and laud the one who performed for our ancestors and all these miracles, taking us from slavery to freedom. And then we're going to drink the next cup of wine. First, and then we're going to say Hallel. And there's a question of where we stop Hallel before the meal. And we're going to finish it afterwards. And there's a debate between Shammai and Hillel about that. And finally, I'm going to go back. So that's the first Seder, right? What's missing? Well, we have the Manashtana. What don't we have? Okay, we have 4 sons. No, they're not there. Dayenu, missing, right? Stuff that we considered the rabbis sitting around discussing the Exodus from Egypt, not there. So the Seder itself, in its earliest form, basically a meal, wine, and some instruction to the father to make sure that the kids get engaged. And then the father will answer by taking a paragraph of the Torah and expounding on it. That's it. There's something called the 30-minute Seder out there. If you go search for Haggadah on Amazon, the first thing you'll come across is the 30-minute Seder. Well, I don't think they were there for 30 minutes, but it's a whole lot shorter than what we do. All right. But now I want to look at what we do. I want to actually look at some of the text and the biblical text that go with it. One that I'm not going to look at, but I want to talk about for a minute, is halachma anya. This is the bread of affliction, which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. All who are hungry, let them come and eat, right? It's written in Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of the people, Jews who lived in the Roman period. They generally spoke Aramaic. Hebrew was a sacred language, not everybody knew it. So it's an invitation to the Seder. And part of it is to make sure that poor people have a Seder, right? We saw in the Mishnah something which said that they have to give people enough wine for 4 cups of wine. Here we get something much more developed. And then at the end of it, we say, here, now we are here, may we be in the land of Israel. Now we are slaves, next year, may we be free. At the end of Halach Ma'anya, that first period, we've done that first section, we've done some time travel. We started out by saying, this is the bread of affliction which our ancestors ate. And at the end, we are our ancestors. Now we are slaves. Next year, may we be free. Right? Remember what Rabban Gamliel said, and that's in the Haggadah. Every person must see themselves as though they personally went forth out of Egypt. And so we are going to relive on a certain level their experience. We're going to eat the matzah that they ate. We'll have some bitterness in our mouth to taste slavery. We'll dip something into salt water to remind us of tears, right? So part of this is an attempt to go back and re-experience it. Part of it was to teach children. Part of it is to go back and re-experience. Let me go back to sharing my screen again. Where are we? Okay. And I want to go to here we go. Okay, so here, what did I do here? No, I'm in the wrong one. Okay. So here we are in Exodus. You remember that we have 4 cups of wine at the Seder. And in fact, it's so important, according to the Mishnah, that we have to make sure that poor people, even the poorest, still have 4 cups of wine. And wine wasn't cheap, right? Where do we get this idea of 4 cups of wine? The rabbis dig it out of this passage from Exodus. Say to the people of Israel, I am God. I will free you. This is God speaking to Moses, commissioning him to go to Egypt and to speak to the people. What does he say? I will redeem you. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians, deliver you from bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary plagues. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you will know, right? So I'm going to look at the Hebrew. Oops, go up. Hotzeit ani v'hotzeti etchem. I will take you out. V'hitzilti etchem. I will save you from their service. V'ga'alti etchem, and I will redeem you. V'lakakti etchem, and I will take you to me as a nation. So Moses, on God's instruction, is to tell the people that God will do for them 4 things. And those 4 things, the rabbis say, Great, we're going to have to drink a lot of wine. We'll drink 4 cups of wine, a lot of wine because it's a symposium. We'll drink 4 cups of wine, and we'll tie each one of those. Why 4? Well, because we have 4 expressions where God summarizes in advance what God is going to do for the people. Now, you remember back to the Mishnah that it said that you should begin in disgrace and end in praise. So what does it mean to begin in disgrace? Well, one answer is Avadim Hayinu Lefaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves. It's really disgraceful to be a slave. I'll start there. But another opinion says, no, we have to go further back. And here we have a text from the book of Joshua. And Joshua said to the people, thus said the eternal God of Israel, in olden times, your ancestor, Terach, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, lived beyond Euphrates and worshipped other gods. I took your ancestor Abraham, led him land of Canaan, multiplied his offspring. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I gave Esau the hill country, and Jacob went down with his children went down to Egypt. So this answer starts way before they were slaves. How did we even get there? And we start back with Abraham's parentage and the fact that they worshiped other gods. Abraham comes out of a place of idol worship. And if we're going to start with disgrace, that's where we'll start, going back to the whole history of the Jewish people. The other answer, we don't have to go that far back. We have both of these texts in our Passover seder as responses to that question, that statement that you should begin with disgrace. First, the one we were Avadim Hayinu Lefaro b'Mitzrayim, and then this one as well. Now I want to come to the 4 children. This is a midrash. It's based around 4 verses in the Torah. First one comes from Deuteronomy. When in time to come your children ask, what are the decrees, laws, and rules that the eternal your God has enjoined upon you? So here, very sophisticated question. This becomes the question. And again, it's asking because we need to answer our children's questions. That's what the Torah says. And this becomes the wise son. And when your children ask you, Ma ha'avodah hazot lahem, what is this ritual? This, of course, is the wicked son. And the answer is there. You should explain to your child, it is because of what God did for me when I went forth from Egypt. Notice that in the wicked son, the rabbis have turned the wicked son into someone who's, at least they interpret it as meaning, this is, what is the meaning of this ritual that you are doing, excluding himself? And the answer is because what God did for me and not for him, when I went forth from Egypt. Then we have a verse that says, and when your children come to you and say, Mazot, what is this? You will answer, it's with a mighty hand that God brought us out of Egypt. And then we have a separate verse, which is actually, we also saw earlier in the answer to the Rasha, and it simply says, and tell your children, this is because of what God did for me when I went forth out of Egypt. There's no question here. It's just being told to tell our child, and therefore the rabbis say, oh, this is a child who did not know how to ask. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, so suddenly we get the 4 children. Right? It's not in the Mishnah. It's a completely different midrash. It's schlepped in here. Why is it schlepped in here? Because of something that is in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that when your son asks, according to the understanding of the son, the father teaches. So we have this midrash, which is a midrash in a sense in response to the text in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, when your son asks, and if he didn't ask, well, you can point all these things out. And when he asks, teach him according to his understanding. And then we get this midrash on the Mishnah, which says, well, there are 4 different kinds of understandings. The father has to have in mind that it might be a wise child, it might be a difficult child. Not that any of us have ever had difficult children at our seder. It might be a difficult child. It might be someone who's not so sophisticated, right? Simple, what's going on, right? And one of those children, some of those children might just sit there and not, despite everything, every prompt, not ask a question. And so here we have a midrash which says there are all kinds of kids out there. One size does not fit all. The point is you have to speak to them where they are. This is, in some ways, this midrash is it's kind of part of the instruction manual for the leader of the seder. It's not really so much that it's something everyone has to say at the seder, though it's become that. It's really part of what's the leader is instructed to say. Okay, I'm going to go back. All right. Now we get the text, which is the principal text that the rabbis will use to, I'm going to go, actually I have a more expanded version. Let me go down to it. Deuteronomy chapter 26. When you enter the land that God is giving you as an inheritance to possess it and settle in it. This is Moses' talking to the people of Israel, telling them what they will do when they're in the land. They've come in, they settle down. You shall take some of every first fruit of the soil, which you harvest from the land that God is giving you. And you're going to put it, so these are the first fruits, put it in a basket, go to the place where God will choose to establish God's name, the temple, and you'll go to the priest there in charge, and you will say, with your basket, I acknowledge this day before the eternal your God that I have entered the land that God swore to our ancestors. The priest will take the basket from your hand, set it down in front of the altar of God, and you will say the following. So this is the declaration that was to be made by the Israelites in Israel now, having come after the Exodus with their first fruits to the temple. And what do they say? My father was a fugitive Aramean or a wandering Aramean, however you want to translate it. He went down to Egypt in meager numbers, sojourned there, became a great populous nation. They dealt harshly with us, oppressed us, and imposed heavy labor on us. We cried to the eternal God of our ancestors. The eternal heard our peace, saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. God freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, awesome power, signs and wonders. And then we're going to stop there. Although the passage goes on, bringing us to this place and giving us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And so, having said that, this is the end of the declaration. I now bring the first fruits that you, O God, have given me, and you take the basket and you bow low before God and you eat. Okay, so that text has nothing to do with Passover whatsoever. It's really a text about the Israelite having entered the land, it's settled there, harvesting fruits, remembering all that had happened to his people and how God had redeemed them, all of that, so that this act of presenting these first fruits is put into its historical context and is deeply meaningful. So he has real gratitude, not just for the fruits he's presenting, the harvest, but for all that God has done. So this text becomes the basis for the Midrash, which is at the core of the Passover Seder. And what will be done with it, I go back to the Haggadah. We're going to take it by piece, and we're going to expound it with other verses. So I'll give you an example. It says, and resided there. From this, we learn that our father Jacob went down not to be absorbed in Egypt, but only to reside there for a time, as it is said. Now we get a biblical quote. They said to Pharaoh, we have come to reside in this land, for there's no pasture for your servants. The famine is heavy in the land of Canaan. Let your servants dwell in Goshen. Just a handful of souls, as it is said. And here we get another biblical quote. And a nation. And now we're going to put another biblical quote. So let me stop sharing now. So what is going on here? The rabbis have taken this passage out of its context. They've schlepped it into the Seder. And they're saying, instead of the meat, the Passover offering, we're going to take this passage out of context. We're going to take it line by line and phrase by phrase. We're going to connect it to other verses, which also have to do with the story of the Exodus. And we're going to expand it. And now I'm going to go back to something which came much earlier. And that was the rabbis who were sitting around in Bnei Brak. You remember those rabbis? Until their students came to them and they said, hey, it's time for the morning Shema. And they were all night long. And what were they doing? They were taking that passage from Deuteronomy and other passages, and they were connecting it to other verses, and they were doing essentially what we're doing here. At least that's the traditional story. There are historians who say, no, they were plotting a revolt against Rome, and this was their cover. You can pick the version you like. I like the traditional one, but I am intrigued by the other one. Okay, I'm going to open it up now. And really, I could say a great deal more. But what I've wanted to do is to give you a feel for how the Torah was utilized by the rabbis to take a pagan form, which was the symposium, and to transform it into something authentically Jewish, because it's about Torah study, because they no longer had a temple and couldn't do any more what the Torah really told them to do, which was to slaughter a lamb and eat it together with matzah and maror. Questions, comments, anything at all? Okay, well, I apparently either I'm an extraordinary teacher, or you've been completely wowed or struck dumb. So I'm going to give this another minute. I also welcome any questions about Passover or the Passover Seder, because we do have a little time left, about 10 minutes. So if anybody has one. Otherwise, we'll end early. Anything at all? Go ahead, Sandy.
Well, I guess I'm a little confused. Thank you. This is wonderful. I have to sort of absorb it all. But when so they didn't eat the Paschal lamb because they couldn't do the sacrifices because the temple was no longer existing. So when did it? Though I mean, people do now eat Paschal. So how did that change?
No. Okay, so we don't. We don't eat. We eat meat, right, at the seder, but we're not eating this lamb which was slaughtered. And in fact, there's a long tradition that you're not supposed to eat lamb at all at a Passover seder, precisely so that it wouldn't look like we were consuming the lamb, which we're not supposed to do. Go ahead.
Sorry, what is the shank bone?
Okay, so the shank bone is a representative of the lamb, which we don't eat. It's simply there. You don't gnaw on that shank bone, right? And in fact, if you look at it, we don't. We're supposed to point to the matzah and the maror, right? Those are the instructions. You don't point to the shank bone because we don't want to say. We simply say the Passover offering, which our ancestors ate, right? What was the reason for it? As opposed to this matzah pointing to it and this maror. Now, we want to be extremely clear that we have a symbol of it on the plate. We're not eating it because we're not allowed to eat it. And in fact, the Talmud talks about, well, what could you have on the plate to replace the Paschal offering? One thing is a boiled beet, presumably because it's bloody, right? Which, of course, at my vegetarian seder, we always have a boiled beet.
Yes.
So, no, we're not eating it. We're referencing it. Great question, though. Yeah, Barry. You're still muted.
So we refer to the holiday as Pesach or Passover, and the meaning is the Paschal lamb, or
so the question,
the English
right,
meaning
so
of
the
Passover
lamb is really the Pesach lamb, right? And remember the story. They slaughter the lamb and they put the blood on the doorposts of the house, right? So, and then God passes over, or the angel passes over and doesn't destroy the Israelites' firstborn, right? So they're making a kind of pun. It is the Korban Pesach, right? But God passed over. It's the same word, so it's a verbal pun. That's really what it is.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to mention something else about the Passover Seder. What we've looked at are rabbinic midrashim created and put into the Haggadah. But the Haggadah was not a closed book. Officially until about the 16th century, because in the 16th century, in comes Haggadah. Right? It's written in Aramaic, which no one was speaking in those days. So it's interesting that it's written in Aramaic, but it's very clear that that's when it enters. We see it in the Haggadah for the first time then, and in no previous Haggadot, because there was a sense, and I think there still is a sense, that you can add stuff to it, that it's not a closed book. And so we have all kinds of readings that we do. You remember during the time when Jews were stuck in the Soviet Union that there was a matzah of hope. that was referenced. Today, people put a Miriam's cup sometimes on the table, and in addition to the Kos Eliyahu, the cup for Elijah, right? All of these things, though some would tell you otherwise, these things are authentic, because the idea that the seder was something fixed and couldn't be added to is simply not borne out by history. It certainly was, and it certainly can be. So, on that note, anything else? Okay, well, we are going to come back to the book of Ezra after Passover. So, Hag Kasher v'Sameach, have a sweet, happy, appropriate, joyous Seder and holiday of Passover. I'll see you in a few weeks. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so
Rabbi.
much. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.